We're here to talk about local economies. Is there such a thing as a local economy? If there is, does it matter? To whom and why? Should we be thinking about economics in a more local vein? After the Scottish referendum, does it really matter? Is autonomy important? How do we want to spend our days and spend our pounds? We have a fantastic group of interesting, eclectic, provocative thinkers. We've got Andrew Sim, who is a fellow at the New Economics Foundation. He's the author of several books and now works actively with Global Witness. We have to my left Charlotte Alldritt, who has advised the government and the Deputy Prime Minister on really tame, boring issues like immigration, energy, transparency, and open data. So she clearly likes to sit in the shadows. To my right, my far right, we have Ciaran Mundy, who may be familiar to many of you as the person leading the campaign for the Bristol pound. And immediately to my right, we have Nigel Dodd, who is a sociologist who hangs out at the London School of Economics and has written a book with the fantastic title of The Social Life of Money. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask everybody to speak for 5 minutes or so to describe where they stand, how they feel about this issue of local economies. I'm then going to ask each of them a couple of questions prompted by their contributions, and then we're going to leave a big chunk of time so that you can contribute your thoughts and your questions. And then in case I forgot to mention it, there's going to be a book signing at the end. So without further ado, Andrew, do you mind kicking us off? Local economies.
I'm going to kick off with one of my favourite thinkers and writers and activists who's core to any debate about the local economy. And these are some words from Jane Jacobs. They may be familiar to some of you. She said, and I quote, "Lowly, unpurposeful, and random as they may appear, sidewalk contacts are the small change from which a city's wealth of public life may grow." Now, why does that matter? That matters to me because over the course of the last couple of decades, we've seen the surgical removal of much of the heart of the local economy to edge of town, out of town, retail parks. In the United States, they even have a description for those kind of great areas of housing that are fed by remote retail parks. They call them the dead zone. Read the newspaper, the newspapers at the moment, the business pages, and you'll see in the hyper malaise affecting the UK's biggest retailer, Tesco's, the seeds of doubt and the cracks in the model of that which led to phenomena like Ghost Town Britain, the death of the high street, where they had surgically removed the heart of the local economy. Now, why do these things matter? They matter because through our ability to recognise the impact of the model which is synonymous with economic globalisation, which we experience when we walk through the doors of the major supermarkets, certain unexpected things happen. Looking at how Walmart has played out in the United States and comparing people's behaviour and shopping patterns in that kind of model with the local economy, shopping in small independent local stores, certain things have been observed. That is, that straightforwardly thinking of that small change from which the wealth of public life grows, in stores like Walmart, etc., people have fewer conversations. We have less meaningful human interaction. Whenever one of these big stores appears, voter turnout goes down. Studies in the United States showing that. Far from the promise that the big retailers bring whenever they arrive in a local area of more jobs, actually there's a net destruction of jobs in the retail sector when we shift from small independent stores to the big major retailers. The flow of money in the local economy is affected because of the so-called leaky bucket syndrome. That is that these great globally integrated remote shareholder-owned retailers suck money, consumer spending out of the local economy, and much more of that spending would otherwise recirculate and expand in the local economy if it went through retailers and businesses which are more locally rooted and locally owned. And then, of course, there's the important thing, which is harder to pin down, but it's about a sense of place, a sense of identity, a sense of belonging. And with the phenomenon that we wrote about at the New Economics Foundation of Clone Town Britain, the homogenisation of the high street, the loss of the local affects that. So there you've got three really important things: the social glue that holds communities together, the economic dynamism of a local economy, and our sense of place, our sense of identity, all bound up with whether or not your local economy has drifted more towards one which is heavily and in an imbalanced way, I believe has happened in the last couple of decades, drifting towards the global or more centred. Now, of course, there's a caveat here. When we talk about local, what are we really talking about? For me, it's about something which Schumacher talked about, which is the gloriously titled Principle of Subsidiary Function. Now, if Schumacher had called his book The Principle of Subsidiary Function, I doubt we would still be talking about him, but he didn't. He called it Small is Beautiful. And he borrowed this notion of subsidiarity from a papal encyclical from Pope Pius XII, who wrote that it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organisations can do. Now, what this means is that it's perfectly sensible for every community to have its own bakery, but not every community might have its own factory manufacturing trains. So when we talk about localism, when I talk about localism, it's about having things as locally grounded and centred as they can reasonably be. Now, there's another caveat to this as well, is that if every area did that in a circumstance in which there's already great inequality, what might happen is that you merely entrench inequality so that rich areas stay and get more richer and poor areas become trapped too. So when we talk about localism, it's not to miss the need for important issues like redistribution at a macro level as well, because at the global level and in a global economy, in which sort of finance-driven globalization, corporate-led finance-driven globalization, we've seen a massive expansion and divergence between rich and poor, and that's something which we read about daily and we need to deal with. And it leads to the situation that if, for example, a great friend of mine, Stan Thakekara, who worked with tribal peoples in the southern India, has major decisions about how do the people growing commodities there integrate in the global economy in a way in which they see great benefit. He sees that the huge potential for sidestepping the classic global commodity economy for communities to be able to trade with communities directly and then capture and share the benefits, and makes the point that under classic globalization, when he sees villagers using Colgate toothpaste, for example, this is another example of the global of the leaky bucket syndrome, the crazy notion that sort of very poor people in India, every time they spit when they clean their teeth, are spitting profits into remote shareholder-owned giant multinationals from America, and there is capacity for localizing the economy there, which does much better for them. It matters also the local economy, because local economies which are healthy and diverse and dynamic are far more resilient. And when we're moving into a world, whether to do with food chains or whether to do with energy generation, in which we are subject to much greater external shocks, the resilience of the local economy is going to be absolutely fundamental. And some of the things that we've learned going back to the so-called moment of 9 meals from anarchy back at the turn of the millennium, when our vulnerable food and fuel supply chains were exposed by road hauliers blocking fuel depots and supermarket bosses going to Whitehall and saying we've got 3 days worth of food left on our shelves. Effectively, we were 9 meals from anarchy. The fact that we didn't have healthy, diverse, not absolutely, but more self-sufficient local economies exposed how fragile and vulnerable is the heavily integrated, centrally, sort of logistically organized global economy that we produced. So resilience, diversity, and localism, these things walk hand in hand and they're going to become more and more important. And the green economy too. reskilling, the themes of reduce, reuse, repair, recycle. These are things which happen locally. We exist locally. And finally, and this is kind of like a speed whirlwind tour of why local matters and why we need to kind of rebalance in that direction, but about fundamental issues of democracy and accountability. And this is vital at a moment in time when being negotiated, we have this kind of charter for corporate lawyers to take democratic decision-making to court over the transatlantic trade investment treaty, which David Cameron is apparently extremely enthusiastic about at the moment. The idea that we need the local economy because there the cause and effect of the decisions we make are much closer together, which means that you don't have that factor in the modern global economy and the modern information economy when it becomes so easy to be remote from the consequences of your actions and your interventions. The reason that localism works better is that we understand the consequences of our actions so much better. I'm going to finish with just a couple of quotes, a couple of my favorite quotes. First of all, from Mahatma Gandhi, who was talking about the importance of interdependence, of internationalism, but where the economy is concerned, he said, "I do not want my house to be walled in or my windows blocked. I want the cultures of all lands to be blown about the house as freely as possible, but I also refuse to be blown off my feet by any." And finally, just to show that nothing is new under the sun in terms of debates, I give you the words from John Maynard Keynes, writing his classic essay of 1933, National Self-Sufficiency, in which he said, "I sympathize, therefore, with those who would minimize rather than those who would maximize economic entanglement among nations. Ideas, knowledge, science, hospitality, travel. These are the things which should, of their nature, be international. But let goods be homespun whenever it is reasonably and conveniently possible. And above all, let finance be primarily national." And then also, as a cautionary, he added, "Yet at the same time, those who seek to disembarrass a country of its entanglements should be slow and wary. It should not be a matter of tearing up roots, but of slowly training a plant to grow in a different direction." My conclusion is that we become too balanced towards the global, and a little slow, careful training back towards a more local orientation would be better for all of us. Thank you for listening.
Well, to follow that was fantastic. I'm going to think about two questions that I was posed in asking to speak to you today. And the first is, should economic policy be more local than national? And is there a mismatch between policy and UK economic geography? And regarding the first, should economic policy be more local than national? Having worked in central government, I can categorically state there is no such thing as spatial awareness in Whitehall. And what I mean by that is that they're not thinking about, when deciding which projects to approve, which funding to award, the impact on the wider social and economic and environmental impact of particular projects. Now, that might be to do the standard Green Book cost-benefit analysis regime a disservice, but I think it's not an exaggeration to say that projects come forward in isolation. Their benefits and costs are reviewed in a very narrow sense. And even though there's been great strides to think about these wider contextual factors, what they don't think about is the particular town or place, city, rural area in which these particular projects that just appear on a piece of paper that come forward are to be assessed. And I think that's a major failing in the way that when we do national policy and we administer funding, it's a very critical point in which things start to fall down. The fact that these projects are compared in isolation means that only the very largest projects are deemed to have macro growth impact. Only the largest, such as the Olympics, say, were deemed to have what they call additionality. The rest is what Treasury officials call displacement. It means that activity that would have happened anyway, instead of happening over here, just happens over there. There's not this new additional net gain. And I've been particularly interested in the concept of economic growth because over the last 11 months I've been running the RSA's City Growth Commission, chaired by Jim O'Neill. We've been looking at how we can enable our cities to thrive and prosper, what that means, and how we can encourage central government to really change the way it thinks about its own processes, but also how and where power should be devolved so that decisions can be taken at a much more local level. So my challenge to central government today and in the final report of the Commission was firstly to think about how you account for local growth and how you build that into your funding and financing decision making. And secondly, to what level should you devolve powers down? And there's a lot of debate around should local authorities get these, should groups of local authorities get these in so-called combined authorities? Should local authorities start to change their own spatial levels so that Bristol, for example, becomes, instead of a particular city centre, becomes a greater city region as a statutory authority? Should Mayor George Ferguson, instead of being Mayor for Bristol City, be Mayor for Bristol City Region? And how do you define those boundaries? Where do you draw the line? And this is being brought up to the fore all the more because Greater Manchester, which is the combination of 10 boroughs, has just been awarded considerable financial flexibilities to be able to control things including housing investment, health and social care, and an array of other transport and economic development tools. So we are seeing progress from the national to the local, and increasingly an awareness that spatial issues really matter. To the second question, is there a mismatch between policy and UK economic geography? Well, to be a bit flippant, I think it's increasingly mattering less. And I say that because the UK economy operates as a whole, and that was guaranteed by the Scottish No vote in September. And it also operates in a global context. But within that, we're seeing cities and towns and rural areas working together. So we're seeing, for example, the North East and Cumbria working with Scottish border towns and local authorities so that they can collaborate across the border, regardless, arguably, and these conversations were in train, of whether they are defined by different nationalities or nations. They are their own local. And similarly, we're seeing greater collaboration between Bristol and Cardiff over in the Welsh border. And I think that all speaks to the fact that where local places are empowered, given the financial and arguably tax-raising fiscal powers, they can be the drivers of their own destiny. And as a result, when we're thinking about national policy, we should be looking to, in following in Keynes's footsteps there, minimise the barriers to trade. That's effectively what he's saying there. And whether that's tariffs in the traditional, late 19th, early 20th century debate sense, or improving connectivity, high-speed rail, improving the ability for freight to be distributed. That was a massive problem. Or even things like the distortionary effect of the housing market and affordability of childcare on the extent to which people can move around and follow the job that they need and want, and the ability for them to live in the place and create the community that they want is also a problem. So tackling those issues, I think, is what we need to focus on. And whether or not there's a mismatch between policy and economic geography, I think the power of local is certainly winning out.
So, Ciaran, is the Bristol pound a barrier to trade?
Definitely, I hope so. The funny thing about it is, of course, you might describe it that way, and orthodox economics would almost definitely see it that way. And yet, and this is the important point, this is the rub really, what happens when people get better connected at a local level is you get more trade. Because it's a very important factor in terms of the social, the geographic location of businesses, the cultural impact of people trading with each other, is massively undervalued, I think. So I think when we looked at starting the Bristol Pound, it was more about what we wanted to create. It's like the old, I think it's a Socrates quote, we didn't waste our energy fighting the thing that we wanted to stop, but we spent all of our energy, we needed all of our energy focused on the thing that we wanted to create. We knew what it was about Bristol that we loved so much, and it's a very diverse town. I mean, Andrew talks about Clone Town Britain in a very articulate way over the recent years. And Bristol's resisted that in parts, not everywhere. I mean, there's big chunks of Bristol that the only place you can go to buy your fruit and veg is a supermarket. And when you're in there, you'll probably say, oh, well, there's a boxed up pasta dish that can feed a family of 5 for £2.50, and you think it's food, and it's not. It's industrial effluent. But it's boxed up as food. So these issues are a global issue. They're real in Bristol, but we were very lucky that in parts of Bristol we've still got a lot of local ownership of businesses. And I think we understood, the group of people who got together after the crash, because in part the Bristol Pound was a response to the crash. How could we support these local businesses that were so important to the health of the city? We knew that at the heart of healthy communities is locally owned businesses. You see it again and again. And there's so many things that flow from that, whether it's more rewarding and better paid employment, or whether it's access to healthy, locally grown foods. There's so many ramifications of actually being only plugged in to the global economy, which is run by a relatively small group of corporations. We knew that what we had in Bristol was fantastic, and actually the credit crunch was really affecting those people. They didn't have the redundancy financially to cope with the credit crunch, and we wanted to do something. Now, obviously, we were starting from scratch, and we had no Bristol pounds when we started, so we knew that what we would be doing would be as much about telling a story about the importance of local as actually creating from scratch an economic instrument that would be able to deliver change. However, in true Bristol style, a lot of people here have not taken the economic woes that have come to many places lying down, and they've really sort of taken there's a lot of energy in this city that allows people to support each other, and it's an incredibly mutually supportive place. And I think that confidence and that mutual support comes when you do have a lot of people who are used to starting their own businesses, owning their own businesses. It gives a place a lot of confidence, and again, it's something that you just can't easily put a figure on, but it totally changes the culture of a place. So when we started the Bristol Pound, as I say, we started from scratch. But I think on the first night, thousands of pounds went out the door. We ran out of the paper that we'd printed, and we thought, oh God, this actually might turn into something. We thought it might be a one-hit thing. Maybe people will do it tonight, but it's a nice idea. The press are all interested. But actually, since we started, we've seen steady growth in the Bristol Pound. So we started out, obviously, with nothing. And over the course of 2 years, we moved up to, I think we created about maybe between 600,000 and 700,000 Bristol pounds, which is a relatively small amount in the overall Bristol economy, obviously. But it's a lot in terms of the small businesses that depend on relationships with individual customers within their communities. We think probably next year we'll go through £1 million worth of Bristol pounds being spent in the city, and from naught we're to £1 million with starting out with what was a completely voluntary team of people. It's really said something to me about something that's really changing out there, actually. People, after the crash, there was that moment, I think we were talking about it earlier, it's just for a moment the lights were on and we could see what the international banking system was about. And people had that moment to grasp, actually, that maybe it wasn't being operated in their interests. But it also, the fear that was struck into people's hearts about it, thought, shit, maybe we should do something about it. But what can we do? And I think a lot of people felt very paralysed by that. So as much as anything else, just demonstrating by creating our own money here in Bristol, or actually conditioning money here in Bristol to work under a set of rules that we think works for the region. That's what it's about, really. It shows that you can actually make a genuine intervention at the grassroots level. And I think that's one of the greatest achievements we've made, because since we've done that, we've had maybe 40 different locations around the UK and across Europe and further afield from China to Australia to Ireland to Spain are saying, well, we didn't know you could do that. Is it legal? Can you really do that? And it's that spirit in Bristol which was really fantastic about, well, we'll just do something and then apologise later if we have to, rather than asking for permission, which helped us do it here. And I think in other places maybe that wouldn't have happened. But that spirit is growing, I think, and partly because of that moment of realisation that actually the banking system isn't really there designed to serve us. It's not actually a public service, which in my view it should be, it absolutely should be. It's actually, they're serving their own very narrow interests, and people are aware of that now. And if we can do something to show that, well, you don't have to sit down, you don't have to take it lying down, you can actually do something about it. And that emergence over the last 12 months, we have met dozens of groups up and down the country and overseas who are interested in doing something similar. And I think there's a rising tide of people who are going to respond to this and actually create another system. The potential is there now to create another system. At the moment, we might just be a fly in the eye, but that's actually a very important thing to be. And things are growing, and we've had almost nothing but positive feedback from people about it. One of the really interesting factors about the Bristol Pound is that the people who use it, just through using it, because they know what the values are that are embedded in it. After all, money's not, and I completely reject the sort of orthodox economics idea of people as individual rational actors. The economy exists within a social framework, and with that comes a whole set of values. And people should be democracy depends on people being able to embed those values within the structures that support society and make it work. If you can't do that, you don't have a democracy, in my view. Voting once every 5 years isn't really going to cut the mustard. People have to be involved and have to be able to embed their values in the structures that make society work. So I'm going off on a slight tangent there, but back to the direct experience of the Bristol Pound. Some of the initial research we've done, and it is early days, of course, is that just by using Bristol Pounds, it actually improves how people feel about themselves and about their community. It makes them more likely to do positive things within their community. That's exactly the kind of effect money should have. Normal money, and research again is quite clear about this, when people even think about money, or use money, or see images depicting money, it has the opposite effect on their psyche. I think it's incredible that we've been able to reverse some of that. Instead of it making people think and feel slightly more selfishly, a bit more nervously, a bit more about themselves, it's actually made people think in a more expansive, communitarian way, which is an achievement which we hadn't really factored in when we started it. But it's something that's been a really, I sometimes think that the sort of economic instrument with all the economic measures that goes with it, and lots of people want to measure how big are the transactions, what's the footfall in the businesses that use it, and so on. Actually, the social impact and the psychological impact on how people feel about themselves and about the communities they're in, I think is as, if not more important, an impact than the direct sort of hard economic measures that we're making.
Great.
Okay, localism. I've say something very briefly about localism, and then I'll just talk about money. Summarise what we've got. Localism makes businesses more accountable to their customers, embeds individuals in their community, makes businesses and consumers more aware of the consequences of their economic behaviour, makes supply chains more sustainable, makes communities more resilient. Buying local keeps money moving locally, which is a virtuous circle. Buying local can increase the velocity of money, which means that it benefits more people. That's it. Lecture over. That's localism. Of course, it's a good thing. I'm inclined to say, what a silly question. Now to money, which is why I'm here, because nobody asked me to come here to talk about localism. They asked me to come here to talk about money. And we're going through a monetary revolution. And the Bristol Pound is part of that. But it's a difficult part of that, I think. And I don't want to pour rain on anybody's parade, and I'm going to praise what Ciaran's done to the skies. But all year I've been flying around the world talking about Bitcoin. In fact, I was talking to someone the other day I was saying, I'm really not sure what to say in Bristol. And I said, just talk about Bitcoin. I don't know if anybody here ever has anything to do with Bitcoin, but we won't talk about Bitcoin. We'll talk about Bristol pound instead. The other thing that we're talking a lot about is the state and banks. Today, there was a debate in the UK Parliament on money creation, the first time in 170 years that issue has been discussed. 23 MPs turned up, I think, but it's better than nothing, and it's a move in the right direction. But those are the two key levels on which money's being talked about actively across the world. You know, Bitcoin is a global virtual currency, and Positive Money campaign about money creation. It works at the national level, and all the time underneath, for quite some years now, there's been bubbling away the local currency movement. And this has been going on for a long, long time. I mean, the local currencies are very old. And as one of the most famous experiments, which reminds me of the Bristol pound, was in Austria in 1932. And everybody knows about this. And this local town deposited money in a bank, proper money, and then they issued notes based on this, and did some wonderful things. They built a ski jump, they mended things and built things. Unemployment went right down, it was tremendous. It lasted a year or two, and 200 other towns in Austria wanted to join in with this. And then the Austrian government got frightened and banned the use of alternative currencies pretty much on an emergency basis, and that was that. It was over. But there are lots of other famous cases where there have been successful local currencies, but there are also lots of cases where local currencies really haven't lasted very long. So the first thing I want to say is please be aware of what you've achieved in Bristol. It's phenomenal. Bristol is unique. It's the first city-wide local currency that I know of. We've had urban currencies before. Brixton was, I think, the first, certainly in the UK, example of an urban currency, but Brixton's tiny compared to Bristol. So you have a city-wide currency, which is used by it may be a tiny speck in the eye, but nevertheless, there's something like 800 businesses involved. And I've forgotten the number. I discussed it with Ciaran today. A lot of individuals too. So it's an incredible achievement that Ciaran and his team have put on. I think it's absolutely stunning, actually, and I'm incredibly excited by it. And I think it has a very, very high chance of succeeding. So I'm really genuinely excited by this. I've been working on money for a long, long time, and I think the Bristol pound is up there with actually much higher than Bitcoin as something that sort of gets me going. Bitcoin's become a bit of a bore to me, and Bitcoiners are unbelievably boring. So we can, and I can't even tell you any jokes about Bitcoin because there are none. I've Googled and Googled and Googled, make me laugh about Bitcoin and nothing. Okay, so that's the good stuff. And what local currencies do is they take the veil off, if you like, off of the social life of money. A plug for the book there. But they reveal the mechanics of money in a way that we don't normally think about. I mean, I tell this story of when I was a student and I was carted around in the back of a Securicor van as the guy with the stick that was meant to hit anybody that tried to take all the cash away. And what I saw in that summer job was, if you like, the infrastructure of money, what's involved in the cash economy, just moving the stuff around, how it operates in these great underground vaults. And something like the Bristol pound unveils that. It shows us some of the workings of money. It makes us think much more about money, and I think that's a very good thing. Now, here's the rub. Now, I'm a money geek. And I've been working on money since I was a student, and I'm kind of obsessed with it. So for me, The big questions when I was first asking about things like the local currencies was, will they work as money? And I can think of all sorts of ways that you could improve something like the Bristol pound. I spent on Monday in Brixton, where the Brixton pound has been going for some years now, and is in an interesting moment of its history. I mean, it's not all that clear where it's going to go. And there's a sort of an energy issue there, and it's inevitable this will happen, and I suspect it may happen in Bristol too. But I come to this sort of thinking, okay, how can you make this money work? Because for me, it's just a beautiful thing. Money is a fantastic tool that we've invented, and it can work in all sorts of interesting ways. But that's the wrong question to be asking, of course, because the Bristol pound wasn't set up because Ciaran has a money fetish. That's my problem, not his. He has a local fetish. He loves his city, and the organisers of the Bristol Pound love their city, and they want the city to grow and to be vibrant. And so, me with my money fetish, I say, well, okay, how exactly can money work towards that end? And I think these are more difficult questions. And the jury is out on the effects of local currencies. And I'm glad Ciaran said what he said, and this isn't a criticism for one moment. It's actually very, very difficult to measure properly how effective a local currency is. To a large degree, the people that take up a local currency are already fully embedded into the local economy. I mean, it's a self-selecting bunch of people. Likewise, businesses are already often very well networked locally and often very committed. So in one sense, and there's nothing wrong with this at all, in one sense, a local currency is a sort of affirmation of existing behaviour. And so to measure the extent to which it changes people's behaviour, I think is more problematic. But that's economics, and economists want to measure this thing called LM3, and there are all sorts of technical arguments around it. Andrew would know an awful lot about this, and Neff is very involved in this. But Ciaran's right that there's something else that matters to a local currency. And in a sense, it's a marker of identity. It's a marker of one's participation in a community, and it's a reminder. I mean, to see the Bristol Pound sign on a shop, and it's a reminder of what happens. In that sense, it's showing people or trying to remind people what happens to the money they spend, where it goes, where it ends up, how far it travels. And I think that's probably is far more important, but completely impossible to measure. But it's far more important, possibly, than all these kind of technical measures. So I think that's what we should be thinking about. But it makes, Ciaran's job difficult because, of course, he has to apply for funding and all this sort of stuff in order to make this thing run. So I think the Bristol Pound is wonderful. I have a few questions that I'd like to ask about this because I think it's interesting. And one of them is about pay by text. We're entering this incredible world of payment systems where we can just wave. We can go on the tube now and you can just wave your card. And SMS payment, when it was introduced in Brixton, was really sexy, but now it's unbelievably unsexy. It's really cumbersome. So I'm interested in whether, how realistic it is for the Bristol Pound to kind of go forward with technology, because it's incredibly expensive. But pay by text is. I know in Brixton they're sort of wishing that they didn't have it to some degree. That's one question. The second question is the money geeks question, and it's what I call the McDonald's question. In Brixton, McDonald's want to get involved, and you can imagine how that goes down. With the organisers. But what if it's not McDonald's? What if it's another business that's kind of medium-sized but is part of a chain? I mean, in one sense, for a money geek, that would suck up demand for the currency and would help increase the popularity. But from a local point of view, it would be a disaster. So I kind of intrigued to discuss where you draw that line. And I'm sure Ciaran's thought deeply about this and has some interesting things to say. I've got other questions, but one final question is demography. I don't know what the demographics of the Bristol pound are, but I know what the demographics of the Brixton pound are. And it doesn't really spread across the whole community. As I've already said, that the take-up tends to be a particular group of people who are already committed to, and they tend to be middle class, they tend to be well-educated, they tend to be white. And that's not a criticism, that's just an observation. And again, I'm intrigued as to how one can break those sorts of barriers down, those social barriers down, to increase the popularity of the currency. But all of that is premised on believing that the Bristol pound is absolutely fantastic and wanting it to succeed.
Great. Thank you, Nigel. Okay. I think because our panelists have all talked quite a lot, instead of hearing from me, I'd rather hear from you.
Okay, I've got two comments and then my question. My first comment is about the Bristol pound. And I'm a sort of a surprising convert to text-to-pay. So it deals with your point.
Good.
That when I first started the Bristol point, well, okay, I'll use the notes, but I couldn't possibly use a phone. I'm just coming up with all that stuff. But in fact, it is fantastically convenient. It's more convenient than a credit card, and it enriches our relationships. I'm very surprised to say this. I'm not particularly, not particularly touchy-feely person, but it does. They say, "Oh, yeah, hello, Richard. Good to see you." Da 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 da. And I found it had a quite astonishing benefit in the way that Ciaran describes in helping build the relationship within the community. My second comment is that I was very interested in the point about the sort of very narrow view of the Treasury. I went to a very interesting talk at the Cabot Institute a couple of nights back by Peter Head, who reckons they've now got computer systems which can model a city region, which at last enables people to think in a sort of regional way about what interventions will have, what effect interventions will have on the region. Does anybody in the panel have a view on how those sort of computer modelling systems can be and could be and will be implemented at a local level to enrich the economy in every sense of the word, financially, socially, etc.? That's my question.
Great, thank you. Well, Charlotte, you've been at the heart of government. Can the computer models help us on this front?
Well, I think you've got to start from that city region. I think identity is an important part of defining a city region, just as much as what we call functional economic area, which we typically define by travel to work patterns. And there you look at transport data and it all gets quite technical. But do I feel a part of London where I live? Yes. Do I have a sense of what my local travel to work area is? I suppose so. But to what extent does my computer modelling assess my identity with the area of London I live in and my relationship to it? Probably very little. That being said, I think in order for cities to be able to understand their local economies and critically integrate their economic policy with their social policy, with health, with education, with economic development planning, housing, transport, the whole lot, which is where I hope the devolution agenda will take us, it is vital that cities have a critical data and evidence-based platform upon which to make critical decision-making. Not least because, again, I hope we move to a more outcomes-based model of how we finance public services, for example, not just chucking up money at particular services to do what they've always done, but really asking them whether they're achieving the things that they intend to do for the benefit of the people that are using those services and living in the places where they're delivered. So I suppose the short answer is I really hope the Treasury doesn't think it can continue to dictate from Whitehall if it just improves its technology system. But I think that city regions need to be empowered and use the tools available to them to understand what's going on in their place. And certainly IT has got a lot to play in that, but certainly the power of local is also about the ability to get underneath those relationships and understand the human element that runs the whole lot.
Great, thank you. Yes, there's a gentleman here in the front, please.
Just a follow-up to a comment that Charlotte made, which I very much enjoyed, really, your discussion or your description of the Green Book and cost-benefit analysis. And you're also talking about devolving political power more from the centre locally. I mean, given that the Green Book and cost-benefit analysis tends to lead to certain types of capital investment decisions and schemes, is there an innate tension there? Because if you devolve power locally, the local people who get that power are still going to be following the rules of the Green Book. Therefore, do we need to reform the Green Book and, you know, the way we do cost-benefit analysis?
I think the Green Book, in and of itself, is fine. You know, it does the job it's meant to do. It asks in a very systematic way.
Can you just explain to people a little bit what the Green Book is?
Sure, sorry. It's a set of rules that says, is this an affordable project to run? And it looks at the various components of that, which will all be very logical and very rational and make an incredible amount of sense. The point I was trying to make is that they are taken in isolation, typically. So they have no greater sense of investment in Bristol versus an investment in Brixton, when those particular projects, were they done in one and not the other, could be very, very different. And so I know that the Department for Transport in particular is trying to do a lot more sophisticated work on how it can revise its application of the Green Book. And economists that I've spoken to over the last year, that I suppose are conflicted in the degree to which they think it's a useful tool. I think it's a useful tool, but it needs to be applied in a much more sophisticated way. And in the final report of the Commission, we really call upon Treasury to think about how they can consider that. And I think they're open to that conversation, but certainly they don't want to move away from what has to be a defensible, transparent, and what they would consider fair way of assessing who gets what, where, and why. So Green Book Plus, I think, is probably where I'd come down on.
I think I agree very much with what you say. I don't know about the Green Book Plus bit, if that would go far enough. In some situations, I've got more experience actually looking at the application of these things in transport locally. I used to chair the local sustainable transport group in Bristol. And the application of these models and these ways of applying certain rules, which, as you say, seem very logical, always have assumptions in them. Mm-hmm. They always have assumptions. And if they're coming from central government and given out to the regions and the cities, etc., and there's no ability to question those assumptions, you actually railroad people into doing things in a certain way. And I've seen that happen time and time again in Bristol, where the decision to go down certain investment pathways in relation to transport investment is very much dictated by the economic modelling that underpins it, such as what is the economic value you would ascribe to somebody using a car, and how quickly they're able to get from A to B. And it makes it actually impossible to invest in the changes that are required to develop a local green economy where most people cycle to work. It makes it almost impossible to get the level of investment shifted away from building roads and support infrastructure for cars into public transport and into cycling. And I would say the same, just to answer the question about the modelling, the devil is so much in the detail and the underlying assumptions and the theoretical economic modelling that's behind that. If that's what's driving the development of those models, with those assumptions that reside currently in orthodox economics, that it won't help, in my view. It could actually be a complete disaster. It'll just embed further a certain way of thinking, and it'll just give a local tool to play out those rules which are normally played out.
Thanks. Does a local currency only work because of its locality? And would extending an alternate currency nationally or internationally remove any benefit derived from it?
Great question.
What is the optimal size for to effectively operate a currency at? I mean, part of the problem with the euro, of course, is the sort of centre periphery. It's impossible to have an interest rate which works for one area as well as it will work for another area. So the logical riposte to that is that why wouldn't we have multi-level currencies? It may be that the euro is extremely good for certain kinds of transactions, but you might want an extremely local currency, you might want a regional currency, you might want a bio-regional currency. I think perhaps one of the ways ahead will be far more experimentation with currencies which have clear and explicit purposes to deliver particular social, environmental, and public goods. But these guys over here are the experts.
Well, in our particular example, we've looked at this, and what's happening on the ground at the moment is that we've taken a look at the city region as a kind of an economic, almost like a bioregion, if you like, that some people refer to, is that how can Bristol meet its needs from the region as much as possible? And then the currency is designed to deliver that. And it's actually designed over time to try and steer us towards a different kind of economy, rather than just say, oh, people do this at the moment, so how can you enable people to do what they do at the moment? It's not just about that. It's about actually gradually, over time, putting a steer into the tanker. So it might look like a small steer now, but actually the tanker will end up at a very different destination over time. It's a kind of an economic instrument to try and achieve that for us. But yes, we have come across this issue now of other places want to do local currencies that support local ownership in their area. But is there a kind of natural connection between those different currencies? Maybe they would allow some interchange between them. So the question has repeatedly come up in the last year of like, well, let's say Manchester has its own local currency, for example, and I'm visiting Bristol. I'd like to be able to spend with locally owned businesses in Bristol while I'm in Bristol. So can I do that with my Manchester pounds? Potentially you could. But the important thing is that if Manchester devises a currency, a complementary currency, to work in Manchester, it can decide if it wants something that interchanges with the Bristol pound. And Bristol pound likewise can make that decision. Together they can make that decision. If it works for them, they can do it. The technology that we've developed certainly will allow that, but the rules of different local currencies will have to be established before we can see if you can interchange them. And that will be, in the end, down to those localities. And the power should then remain in that locality if that's something that they see as benefit to their local to regional economy.
So I want to play devil's advocate here for a second, because I hear everything everyone's saying about the power of local, and it's really good, and it makes people feel more connected, and it drives the economy, and it drives democracy. I think that's all great. So one of the companies that's based here in Bristol is IMDb, the Internet Movie Database. Is that a Bristol company? It's a global company. It's an internet company, as many, many companies here are. Is it local? So I'm puzzled by the fact that at the time that we now have the world's largest global network for communicating and transacting that the world has ever seen, we're talking about local.
That's why
Isn't
that why we're talking about local?
Yes, but is the University of Bristol, is that a Bristol company or is that an international company? So at what point does something stop being local and become something else?
Can I take that? So I spoke earlier about identity, and I think you can have multiple identities. And I think a company can decide that whilst it operates globally, it has a positive local impact that it wants to make. It wants to have a positive local relationship with its local customers and or employees or whatever.
So it would pay its employees locally,
Well, yes, you'd hope so.
but with local currency.
Well, that could come into the conversion component. So I don't know whether I don't know enough about the mechanics of the Bristol pound as to whether that would make sense, but I don't see why not.
Some companies, are they local, are they national, are they international? Well, we have a set of criteria which actually makes it 99% of the time it's really straightforward. So we've got about 850 registered businesses, and we've had maybe 6, 7, 8, maybe a dozen at the most where we haven't really known. Some very big companies have applied to join, and it's been a straightforward no. So if you're floated on a stock exchange, then no. That's the rules that we've chosen.
Okay.
Right.
If you're not predominantly locally owned, as in owned by people who live within the region, so 51% or
The
more.
answer is no.
So that's our criteria, but it doesn't mean that other people would have different criteria. So I mean, if as other people probably follow in the wake of what we're doing, we might find that they have a different set of criteria. And I would say that hopefully they'll be well informed when they do that, but that's down to them, actually.
Right.
So it might be that because we've got a good mix of a very strong base of locally owned businesses in the region, that it enables us to be stricter about the intertrade that we're trying to encourage. And the other thing to remember is it's a complementary currency. We don't see the Bristol pound as something that would completely replace other currencies. We will have Bitcoin in the future. We probably will have a national currency, but who knows? We'll have a Bristol pound, and there'll probably be other systems. We're already creating other currencies right now. In the Bristol pound to serve other purposes, whether that's time banking or whether that's local credit creation for SMEs. You need this diversity of currencies to actually serve the communities better, rather than just having one, as Andrew referred to, the euro across Europe. It does serve some functions very well, but it doesn't serve all the functions that people need served.
So, Andrew, do you agree that the local is counterbalancing the overwhelming power of a few banks that we saw the power of when they all collapsed? Are those banks going to change because of the growth of local currencies?
It's a very interesting question. And when the gentleman in the audience was talking about the Treasury and its models, it reminded me of the moment at the peak of the crisis back in 2008, when with my colleagues at NEF at the time, just before we produced a publication called Where Does Money Come From? We did another one called Where Did Our Money Go? And we launched it on the day that Osborne was giving a speech at the Conservative Party conference, and he was kind of put on the spot by one of the television interviewers. And we had a phone call from the Treasury afterwards saying, I wonder if could you speak to my boss? He'd like a briefing about your report. And we said, yeah, sure. And he called back about 10 minutes later. He said, actually, could you come in and speak to us in the office? And we went, yeah, sure. And we kind of went into the Treasury and went down the corridors, the famously long corridors, and kind of opened the doors into this. So we were expecting just to kind of see him and his boss, and there was a table with 25 civil servants in the Treasury sat there looking at us, and we thought, well, what's going on? And we realised at that point that in looking at us with their quiet, expectant faces, they really thought we knew where the money where the money had gone. But at the same point, in terms of this, the question about the banks, I mean, talking about the models, I mean, it's a bizarre thing to think about, but the Treasury's model excludes banks. It's the macroeconomic model that it uses excludes banks because it doesn't think that as agents they can have a significant effect on the economic life of the country. And when we were lobbying around the Vickers Commission, we actually took them to task. We went to see if we'd have any chance of success on a judicial review on the fact that they would not acknowledge the true nature of credit creation, the true nature of money creation. And what has been achieved just in the last few years, I mean, the acknowledgement of this in the Bank of England's own internal documentation now, that there is some idea, some greater understanding of how money is created. And I also kind of think it is strange, and I think we are at this turning point at which we are going to see a greater diversity coming into the economy. Because, the argument about the public sphere, whether it's the government or other aspects of the public sphere, creating money has always been that the public sphere would be very bad at it. It would direct it and spend it very badly. It would probably end up being inflationary and would probably lead to a crash, which is of course not what happened when we left the job to the private banks. So I think we're on a better footing now. We're moving in the right direction, and the success of things like the Bristol pound is puts us on a good footing.
But what about the taxation system? We have a vast vacuum cleaner structure in this country. I think it goes back to the Tudors, but we've always pulled things to the centre. Till you move taxation, and I speak as somebody who spends a lot of time in Switzerland, which has 3 different taxes, that really puts power back to the community in a way that the Green Book and the Bristol pound, with the greatest respect, I don't think do.
I think that fiscal devolution will start to creep up the agenda as cities that are in receipt of greater powers and flexibilities will realise the limits of those. They are able to retain, at the moment, 50% of the business rates that they raise, local authorities are. And They are not, however, allowed to vary the rate, for example, that they set. Council tax is nominally in the hands of local authorities, but when Eric Pickle stands up and says, we congratulate all local authorities that freeze council tax, and actually we're going to incentivise them to do so, you can see the effect that has. So I think there's going to be a greater move towards localising those two taxes in particular, and then you could start to ask questions like, well, why would you not localise? And I use that term broadly because you need to factor in scale. It's not necessarily efficient from a public finance perspective for every tiny place to raise its own taxes. However, when you start to operate at a greater scale, such as a Bristol city region, for example, you could get into a situation where it maintains its own national income tax. And that's something that Graham Allen MP, who chairs the Political and Constitutional Reform Select Committee, is considering. You could see why not vary corporation tax. But I think probably I'd go further and say that our tax base is imperiled, in part due to the changing nature of businesses in general, and we probably need to review the whole lot.
In Switzerland, it's interesting because you go to shop in Switzerland, you can pay in euros or Swiss francs, but not your taxes. You have to pay in Swiss francs, and the denomination of taxes has a huge impact on the monetary system. And I'm glad you mentioned it. I don't think you meant this, but you got there. In a sense, because it's massively, it's the big kind of elephant in the room. And as long as the government insists on taxing in pound sterling, and local government too, that has a major impact on the kind of money people use. And if there was more openness there, it would have a tremendous impact. And if I don't know what happens in Bristol, but that would be tremendous if you could pay your local council taxes in the Bristol pound, and maybe there was even a discount. Would be even better, because that has a huge. I mean, there's a theory of money, which is that effectively, what is tax is money, and so if the government said we'll only accept taxes in Coke can rings, then that would be money, and because it has a huge impact, and this goes all the way back to a state theory of money. Friedrich Knapp, a German, 1905. Keynes talked about this. Is a massive impact, and we don't talk about this enough. So I think tax is a major issue.
Ciaran, you're such a tease. I'd like to hear how do you regulate the supply and value of local currencies?
The Bristol pound, as it was first established, as it still currently is and will be for the foreseeable future, is actually a conditioned form of sterling. So it's not regulated by us, which makes it easier on the issue of tax. You can pay your taxes to the local authority as business using Bristol pounds, and we hope soon you'll be able to pay your council tax as well. Good. And that means that money it's a commitment on the local authority to respend it in that way. But in terms of the how the money supply issue, we don't make a direct intervention in that, because you have to swap sterling for Bristol pounds at the moment. We do have a plan to move to doing credit creation in the foreseeable future, hopefully in 2015. But the key difference that we'd like to introduce for those businesses who take up that credit is it'll be zero interest bearing credit. So we think that's like a very significantly different way to create money out of thin air. If you're going to create money as debt, which is how most money is created, the vast majority of money is created as debt. The big problem comes not so much as creating it as debt, but actually adding interest onto the repayment of that debt. That's where the problem comes. That forces everybody to want to grow the economy all the time, whether growing the economy is something that you want to do for other reasons or not. So I hope that answers your question, and to some degree. In terms of controlling the level of credit that we issue in the future, if we do get this credit creation scheme up and running, it's a very good question. It will be based on a range of different sort of factors that you would normally use to rate the capacity of businesses to do that business. So the credit is based on the capacity of the local economy to do more business if possible, and then create credit which allows that then to happen. So we're matching it to the capacity of the local economy with various measures.
Thank you. Going back to this question of the perimeters of what constitutes local, I work quite closely with, not for, but with supermarkets. particularly in mandatory food waste audits, so in the kind of food waste scale. But something I'm noticing is they seem to be really latching onto the idea of local, and I don't want to use the word greenwashing too much, but there does seem to be a real trickle that's running throughout. I mean, even Coca-Cola are doing this ridiculous campaign of putting people's names on bottles in this kind of attempt to localize systems, and it's, quite ridiculous, but I think it's, semi-working. So it seems that supermarkets are trying to come back to this idea of, we're using local farmers, we're using local systems. We know in the way Tesco works with local dairy producers, milk producers are at a loss. I mean, we know their systems, without sounding like too much of a kind of raving supermarket hater, like they are manipulative, their systems, and they are not for local. But they're very clever in their capacity for arguing that they are. So I suppose a question to Ciaran and actually to the whole board, to what extent do you say no to supermarkets? And kind of to what extent do you get in bed with the devil, or do you stand from the outside and shout at him or her?
We've been talking a lot about money, but an economy is more than just money. So how does local money, relate to building local economies in the context of supermarkets?
I mean, this question's come up actually repeatedly. So when we started, as you said, there's a lot of very clever, wonderful people who work for big organisations like supermarkets. And we were contacted by some supermarkets, some of the bigger supermarkets that you might know, and said, hey, we love this local money thing. Can we join in, And it's like, because their marketing people get it completely. It's on a very emotional level, it works, which is why it's quite important to some degree. And you've got to remember that. But actually, we've very easily, it's been easy for us in Bristol to decide, well, actually, we don't really need you to be part of it. In places where there isn't a choice for people to go and get their food, especially fresh fruit and vegetables, that's going to be a tougher choice. And there are towns up and down this country that are increasingly, and whole communities that are increasingly in that situation. It's not, so for us, it's an easy choice to say we don't need that, and we think it might kill our scheme in Bristol, actually. We've got plenty of, why? Because actually, if a national supermarket or international supermarket chain was to take part in it, then how is that locally conditioned money there to support independent, locally owned businesses? That's what we're about.
If they're not buying locally.
They'd have to.
They would have to.
They'd have to.
If you believed that they would use that money to then source locally, and also there's the whole issue of coming back to tax, is that if you look at the tax revenues split between small and medium businesses and larger corporations over the last 10 years, it's fallen off a cliff, the contribution that large companies make towards the tax yield. It's gone down by a quarter or something in 10 years. Who takes up that slack? The SMEs pick up that slack. Okay, so we definitely, in Bristol, have decided quite clearly that we're going to support locally owned businesses, but it will be a tougher choice for places that they really are dependent on their local supermarkets for very basic food.
Andrew, is Ciaran making the right call?
When you walk past a Sainsbury's local, it's not local in any sense in which we would understand it to be the case. And Tesco is very, famously have described products on their shelves as being local when they've come from 100, 200 miles away, etc. And I think that's pretty clear too. I think ultimately the question I'd come back to is businesses and how they're organised. They carry with them a kind of self-replicating DNA. And the business model of the four major supermarkets is highly centralised. They have centralised buying structures. Their logistics work in a certain way. The threshold they'd have to cross to be anything like our common understanding of a locally rooted business, to overcome those other issues of net financial extraction, net job destruction, net dissolving of the social glue that holds communities together would be so great as to fundamentally rewire them. And if they ever did turn around and break themselves up, for example, I mean, let's just take as a kind of a little rule of thumb, a test of faith. And when I always kind of think about, Tesco's, if you believe the CSR line on many of these things, there will be a sign at the checkout on the basis that we know that 1 basket in 3 of fresh produce gets kind of chucked away. There will be a sign at every till saying, okay, put 1/3 of everything in your basket back on the shelves, please, because we know you're going to waste it. That will be a test of their ability on that. The Competition Commission makes the point that when you've got more than 8% market share, it gives you abusive power along the supply chain. Supermarkets turned around and broke themselves up so that they held no more than 8% of a market in any kind of given area. Then I might start to take them seriously. I think we're so far from the point at which we could take as serious their commitment to having a fundamentally different kind of pro-local, positive, self-replicating business DNA as for me to not really kind of worry about us needing to go there. And I think there are, in the circumstances that Ciaran talks about, that if you've got this kind of situation where, as a consequence of failed and weak regulation, you end up with the single water standpipe in the town being one of these supermarkets. Well, that's demonstration of the need that we need to kind of reshape the marketplace to open the marketplace so that we can have a better and more resilient and vibrant diversity of local business. That would be my thought.
As I've been listening to this, and this is a question for Ciaran and Nigel, I've been increasingly worried as somebody who lives in Bristol. What is my political power over the local currency? I have a political power, at least in theory, because I vote for an MP who sits in Parliament, who can represent my views to the Treasury and so on. But I have no power, Ciaran, over you.
Good luck with that, by the way.
Yeah. It's working.
Well, I said it's
working fine.
It's
but
a very direct question.
I'd like Nigel to answer this question too, because it's going to affect every local currency and affect other currencies as well, because you might argue that I don't have that with things like Bitcoin.
Yes.
But all these currencies, I think there's somebody that stands behind them, or there's, in the sense of creating credit, what happens when that goes wrong, and what's the mechanism of political control? You said you would accept a company. You said a company came to us and we would to ask if you could use the Bristol pound, and we said no. Now, what if that was my company? How would I politically have power in that sense to say, wait a minute, this is not a fair playing field? What gives you the right to refuse or accept my ability to use a commonly traded currency?
So, how do you have influence, in the example of the Bristol pound, over how it's run? Well, we run it as in the style of a multi-stakeholder cooperative. There's a community interest company which has an asset lock on it, so we can't run away with any profits that we make. And we work hand in hand with a community bank, well, effectively a bank. It's the Bristol Credit Union. That's a member-owned and run organisation. So everybody who joins the Bristol Pound becomes a member and comes to regular meetings about the scheme, and also gets to say how the credit union is run, which manages all the accounts. So we have built into it a structure which gives everybody a say, and we're very clear about that because it's it's very much in the DNA of what we're about, is that this isn't money which is a system that we've developed because there's a small group of people who really like it and think we can make a pile of cash out of it. It's a service for the people of the region, and it's owned by the people of the region through the membership of the Bristol Credit Union, which is what used to be called an IPS, but they're called something else now. And you have a direct say, a much more direct say. You can come along to a meeting at the credit union or at one of our members' meetings and say, this is a problem for me. You didn't let that business in. I want to know why. I think you should. And we take. I've got a list of all the things that we've had at all our members' meetings. People have said, we want this to happen, this to happen, this to happen. And we've tried to do, I would say, the vast majority of those things that we've been told. You won't get anything like that if you have a complaint to make of the Treasury. I know, I've tried.
I mean, every form of money has politics built into it, and the important thing is to understand how the politics work. So you mentioned Bitcoin, for example. Bitcoin has a very strong hierarchical structure. It has a very strong politics. It has a small group of elite people that run it. Whatever they say about the machines, it's actually run by hairy geeks. I've met some of them. Bristol Pound isn't hairy geeks. It's Ciaran, but nevertheless, there is a kind of power law that comes in, it seems, into these things. And there has been an issue in the past with local currencies that it ends up being like a little nation state. So I think that is a danger, and I think what Ciaran suggests is correct, that they're building in checks and balances. But your question's a good one in that sense, except the first part of your question, which has a very, very flawed premise. If you were to contact your MP about the monetary system, it's a very likely bet that your MP has no knowledge whatsoever about how the monetary system works. I mean, Positive Money did a survey of MPs, and 85% of the ones surveyed understand nothing about the monetary system. They still think that the Bank of England creates money, which of course it doesn't in the way our system works. So there's a huge issue. So your MP has really no say whatsoever in the way the monetary system runs, unless he or she has a lot of shares at a private bank, in which case they have, the central bank doesn't have that much say, actually. So I think there's a huge kind of problem there. But you're right to ask about the accountability of a local currency scheme, and I think that's absolutely important that you do so. But don't kind of get carried away thinking that somehow the national currency is sort of democratically accountable. I'm sure you're not, because that it really isn't.
Okay, great. Before we wind up, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to answer one question very briefly. Everyone here has talked about the advantages of building the local economy in different ways with different tools. What's the one thing you would recommend as a way of building the Bristol economy to make it more resilient and more vibrant? What's the one thing you would recommend?
Use Bristol pounds.
Okay? Nigel?
There should be more exchange between local currencies. I think that's the only way of sustaining them. On their own, they're not going to be sustainable.
Watch the space.
That's the really exciting thing that Ciaran said. That's the one takeaway from this. The idea that with Bristol pounds or Manchester pounds and Dawlish pounds, whatever it is, that these things can commune. Money wants to move. It doesn't want to stay still, and then there has to be a way of allowing it to move, as well as to move within a community, but to move beyond it. And my fantasy is of a sort of an ecology of money, where you have these different forms of money, not all just relating to sterling, because that's just kind of boring, but a really multi-layered, multi-dimensional currency system. That's what we should be aiming for, and that will benefit a place like Bristol.
So that's more currencies with an exchange.
Yeah.
Also as a means of reducing risk?
I think so, yes. And this was happening with Letts. I mean, I was with Keith Hart yesterday, who was very, very close to the Letts system, and was very close to Michael Linton. And they were using the internet. That was going to be to get the Letts schemes kind of talking to each other. And I think that's a really exciting prospect.
Great. Charlotte?
For Bristol's economy to grow, I think the most important thing is that its politics maps its real geography. So you align the politics of your elected mayor with the actual size of your economy, not just the existing administrative boundaries.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. And Andrew?
Local, per se, takes you only so far. I'm interested in a rebalancing towards the local economy because I think it's integral to the transition the economy has to go through in respect of not just some of the economic challenges we're facing at the moment, but the fundamental environmental challenges we're facing at the moment. So it's kind of rebalancing to the local, but with a particular purpose. So my one recommendation would be, and I should declare an interest because I'm on the board of them, but I would say join your local transition initiative and get active and do it in a coherent and joined up way.
Great. Thank you all very much for a great discussion. Please buy your books with Bristol pounds. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yeah, so good. Yeah.